All right. Well, one of the most common, am I really loud? One of the most common and claimed to be one of the most popular or persuasive arguments for God's existence, pointing at philosophy and science, would be the Kalam Cosmological argument, because it relies heavily on scientific evidence to support premise number two, which is that our universe began to exist, and then showing that things that begin to exist have causes, and if our universe began to exist, then our universe must have a cause. And so this would be strong because it's using science, scientific evidence, to support premises within philosophical arguments that have theological implications. And so while this is not scientific proof for God, this would be how science could be used to show that the belief in God is reasonable, is rational. And so last part of this series was we spent 90 minutes, my guest James Sinclair and myself spent 90 minutes simply looking at the science and physics and cosmology of the Big Bang, showing that it is reasonable to believe that our universe did in fact have a beginning. And we looked at a lot of different theorems and exceptions to those theorems and all these different ideas that are being proposed for and against the beginningless universe and a universe with a beginning. And I think in all of that, while people are researching and looking and testing and probing and trying to falsify different ideas, this idea of our universe having a beginning really does continue to survive the kind of the scientific investigation into that question. And so scientifically, from physics and cosmology, I think it's reasonable to believe our universe had a beginning. We spent 90 minutes answering that specific thing. So what I want to do today in the second part is look first and foremost briefly at the fact that the belief or the support of the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is not just scientific, but there are also two philosophical arguments pointing to the beginning of our universe as well. And so we both have philosophical and scientific support of premise two, and this leads to credibility, or at least the plausibility of this argument. And then the brunt of this argument, or the brunt of the show that I want to spend on today in this second part, is what are the theological implications, right? It's often said there's scientific evidence that supports premises within philosophical arguments that have theological implications. So how is it that Christians get from our universe had a cause to God exists? And that is what I want to focus on for the rest of the show today. That is going to be the question we talk about. And then at the end, as always, the fun part is taking your calls, your questions, your objections, your pushback, your thoughts, anything that you want to offer. If you want to type that into the live chat, you can do so by putting a Q before it so I know I can find it, or you can use the link that I posted there and call into the show and talk with me about your questions. So, anyways, that's the topic today. It's going to be a fun one. My name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well, the show that is designed to train you to think well about the Christian faith and the culture and these cultural ideas so that you can engage the culture well. And I think this argument is one that's thrown around a lot, but I'm trying to do a little bit more of a deep dive to hopefully give Christians and atheists and whoever it is that's talking about the Kalam cosmological argument a little bit more depth so that it can be discussed better, that conversations can be better, that we can talk more accurately, hopefully. And so that is the point of today's show. You know, it reminds me of going in years ago, probably back in 2016. I was at a student conference and the students were talking, and one of the students was like, "Oh yeah, well there's proof of God. You know, it's the cosmetology argument for God's existence." And the speaker goes, "I didn't know, you know, women's makeup and hair had anything to do with God's existence. Tell me about that one." And so, you know, that's just a funny slip up of words, but really it is the importance of going deeper into these topics so that we can speak more with greater intelligence, with more knowledge, and hopefully have better conversations. Just a quick look into the future. Again, love being able to continue to produce shows and help you think well about a wide range of issues. This show's on Thursday because I just finished my third and final year of doctoral coursework, and I had like 12 papers. I think over the 3 years I wrote about 250 pages of papers, read 40-something books, and 12 of those papers were due this year. And so I took a little vacation on Monday and Tuesday, a little break, and now here we are doing the show on Thursday. But my final lectures are the last 2 weeks of May. So This is going to be part 2 on the Kalam. Next week, I'm going to be looking at the Student's Guide to Philosophy of how the Christian worldview has, the Christian intellectual tradition has shaped areas of philosophy. And we'll be diving into questions on metaphysics and philosophical anthropology, epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics. And what does it look like to be a vocational Christian philosopher? And so these are the different chapters in this booklet. So if you kind of have questions on what is philosophy and how has Christianity shaped philosophy, next week's show, hopefully on Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time, back to normal schedule, will be there for you. And then I will be in my doctoral residency courses, but I am pre-recording next week an interview with Abigail Favali. She's a professor at Notre Dame University, and she wrote a book, The Genesis of Gender, and she's going to be joining me for a pre-recorded discussion on gender. So that's going to be in the next part of the Culture series of how can Christians think about this topic of gender, and how can we discuss it well, and how can we make sense of what we're seeing in the culture around us. As far as June goes, the next part of the Christian Worldview series is going to be the Christian worldview. So specifically, what is a Christian worldview and how do we go about understanding that, making sense of it? In our Culture series, we're going to be covering the topic of identity. And again, our Culture series is coming out of this book. There it is right there. What Do I Say When? A Parent's Guide to Navigating Cultural Chaos for Children and Teens by Andrew Christian Walker. Identity is the next chapter in this book that we're going to talk about. And then from our Worldview series, which we're going through the Natural Theology by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, talking about Chapter 3, Kalam Cosmological Argument Now. Chapter 4 is the teleological argument with Robin Collins. And he has agreed to an interview, but I have not set a date yet. And so I got to figure that out. But hopefully that's what's coming up for you all in June. All right, I think that's all the announcements. Again, if you want some Maven merch, there's stuff there that you can check out and support the ministry and continue helping me fund this fun project that I got going on. You can find that on either the website or there's a tab on YouTube that you can click on that says store or something of that nature. Instagram, it's in my bio. But if you sign up for the Think Well email list, which I send out about 10 or so training letters a year, plus some other resources. Being part of that list, you can get an automatic 10% discount on the store. So hey, if you want some discounted Maven merch, I also work for Maven. If you want some discounted Think Well merch, you can sign up for that Think Well training letter. You can do so on my website. Just click on any page, except for the home page. Any other page on my website, think-well.org. There's a button on the right side that says get more resources and discounted merch. You click that and sign up. So anyways, well, let's jump into the topic today because I want to get through this quickly and get to your calls and questions. So again, the Kalam Cosmological argument, it goes like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. And premise 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now again, last show we spent 90 minutes discussing the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. And so I want to now turn to some of the philosophical reasons for believing our universe had a beginning. Now, William Lane Craig co-authored this chapter with James Sinclair. Again, James Sinclair wrote the scientific part of it, and he joined last part. This part is looking at the philosophical arguments, and here Craig gives 2 arguments for a beginning of the universe. Number 1 is that the argument from the impossibility of an actual infinite. And the argument goes like this, that actual infinites cannot exist. Premise 2, that an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite. Therefore, an actual infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. And so this idea stems from this idea that if we have to go back for all of eternity into the past, you have an infinite regress of past temporal events that would count as an actual infinite. And if actual infinites can exist, then you can't have a past infinite regress of events. Now, I think what's important to highlight here is that when I am on TikTok and when I'm watching videos, what is almost always offered at this point is to say, well, look, you can take a ruler and you have 12 inches and you can divide it by half, and now you have 6 inches and divide it by half, and you have 3 inches and divide it by half, and you have 1.5 and divide it by half and divide it by half and divide it by half, and you can have this infinite divisions of that space. And so in the same way, you can have an actual infinite in a, size of a ruler, so to speak. And so this is this infinite, and so the actual infinites, they would argue, can exist. Now, what Craig points out here, and I think is important, and I've almost never heard anyone make this distinction, or when atheists raise this in TikTok debates that I'm watching or listening to, the Christians often don't respond to, is that Craig offers the distinction that I think is a necessary distinction between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. Here's what he writes here. The only legitimate sense in which one can speak of an infinite is in terms of potentiality. Something may be infinitely divisible or susceptible to infinite addition, but this type of infinity is potential only and can never be fully actualized. The concept of a potential infinite is a dynamic notion, and strictly speaking, we must say that a potential infinite is at any particular time finite. And so here is the recognition that, yes, while it is potentially infinite, because you could infinitely keep dividing by half, you are talking about a finite space, a finite limited time, and so it can never be truly infinite or actualized for real. And so this distinction, I think, between potential infinites and actual infinites is important. And so the question is, if that distinction is true, right, and this is just a potential infinite, then that doesn't go to argue against, or that no longer is an objection against the point that true actual infinites cannot exist. Now, Craig then goes on, and this is a common illustration that maybe you've heard before, as he says the best way to support the fact that actual infinites cannot exist is through thought experiments that illustrate the various absurdities that would result if an actual infinite were to be instantiated in the real world. And so the common example he gives here is what is called Hilbert's Hotel. And so Hilbert's Hotel is this is the brainchild of David Hilbert, where he says, okay, imagine this hotel that has a finite number of rooms, and every room is full. So it has 100 rooms, and every room is full. It's completely occupied. And a new guest checks in and says, I would like to check in. And you go, okay, well, that's no problem, because we can just move guests from room 1 to room 2, and room 2 to room 3, and room 3 to room 4, and so on and so forth, all the way to infinity. And guess what? Room 1 is now vacant, and you can move in. And so the question is okay, this is what this hotel would look like with actual infinites. And he then goes on and says, the result of these room change, room 1 now becomes vacant. The new guest can check in. But remember, before he arrived, all the rooms were occupied. Equally curious, there are now no more persons in the hotel than there were before. Right, so now not just 100 rooms, but if it's an infinite number of rooms, every room is full. An infinite number of new guests can show up, and you can just move them all down and make a new room. Or you can have every odd room open up, and now you can check in an infinite number of new guests when there was already an infinite number of guests and all the rooms were full, but now you can have an infinite number of unoccupied rooms just by moving guests down. And he goes, well, how can this be? How can you add more guests and actually not have added to the total number of guests that you have? You can also, by subtraction, you can have an infinite number of guests, and the guests in rooms 1 through 5 can check out, so you have infinity minus 5, but you still have an infinite number of guests in your room. Or you can have an infinite number of guests, and every odd numbered room checks out, and you have an infinity minus infinity, and it still equals infinity. And so he talks about the mathematical absurdity of this, but ultimately how this really cannot be instantiated into the real world. We can have thought experiments where, yeah, it can work, hypothetically in your mind, and so it's not logically impossible, but it is what he would call metaphysically impossible. And so he then kind of goes on and says, for suppose that persons in room 4, 5, and 6 check out at a single stroke, the hotel would be virtually emptied. Oh, from rooms 4 all the way down. The guest register reduced to 3 names, and the infinite is converted to finite. So now you can have rooms 4 all the way down, all leave, and now you only have rooms 1, 2, and 3 occupied, and now this infinity became a finite. And yet, it would remain true that as many guests checked out at this time as when the guests in rooms 1, 3, and 5, every odd number room checked out. And so you can have the same number of guests leave the hotel when all the odd rooms check out, an infinite number of guests leave, and it remains, all the even guests remain there, which would remain an infinite number. Or you can have every guest from rooms 3 down check out, and so you're only left with 1, 2, 3, and so you have infinity leave, and you still now only have 3 left. And so you've subtracted the same number, but you have different rooms left, or different amounts left. And so he concludes here, it follows that a real existence of an actual infinite is not metaphysically possible. And so while it may be logically possible to have this hotel, it is metaphysically impossible. He concludes here and he says the absurdity is not merely practical and physical, it is ontologically absurd that a hotel exists which is completely full and yet can accommodate untold infinities of new guests just by moving people around. And so this would be kind of the first argument. I'm kind of skipping a lot of the other details that he goes into, of looking at the fact that actual infinities cannot exist in the real world, and an actual infinite number of past events that we had to traverse to get here today, therefore cannot exist. And often the objection or response of like, well, you can infinitely divide something, that would be talking about potential infinites, not actual infinites. The second argument that he offers here from philosophy is the argument from the impossibility of formation of an actual infinite by successive addition. And so here he says, we now turn to the second philosophical argument in support of the premise that our universe began to exist. This is the argument from the impossibility of the formation of an actual infinite by successive addition. And here's how this argument would go. A collection of formed by successive addition cannot be an actual infinite. The temporal series, premise 2, the temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition. Therefore, the temporal series of events cannot be an actual infinite. And here, he uses the example that I have used in with students, and I think that students can make sense of this well, is that in order for us to arrive at today, if we're talking about the succession of temporal events, of timed events, you cannot traverse an infinite amount of time, an infinite amount of events, and yet arrive at today. Because in order for today to get here, you would always have to go through another event before today could get here. And if you have to pass through an infinite number of past events before today gets here, then today would never get here. The fact that we are here today shows that the past is not infinite but finite. Now, how do you make sense of that for students? Because I probably said that and you're like, wait, that's confusing. Here's how I try to illustrate this for students. Imagine you're running a race. And before you start the race, the gunman, right, the guy who's about to do the start gun, he goes, ready, set, and he goes, wait, back up one more foot. So all the runners back up one foot on the track and they get ready again, ready, set, wait, back up one more foot. And the question is this, if they had to keep backing up one more foot before the start gun ever went off, would the start gun ever go off? If they had to do an infinite number of backward steps before you could start the start gun, would the start gun ever start? And the answer is no, because if there's always one more step, you would have to go back before you could ever start. And so the question is, how does time, right? If we're marking the time of the race, right? How fast are you going, or how long have you been running? If the time starts at the start gun, then you've recognized at some point the runners stopped backing up, the start gun actually started, time began, and now they are running in the moment. And so the question is, if they're running, you had to have that beginning. If they had to back up an infinite number of steps before the start gun ever went off, the start gun would never go off, time would never start, and they would never actually be running, just like we would never be living. The other example I often use is fireworks. If you're going to have a fireworks show, eventually you have to stop setting up fireworks and start launching them. But if you had to set up an infinite number of fireworks before you could ever start the show, then you're never going to get a fireworks show, right? If you know for a fact if fireworks are being launched into the sky, that at some point they stopped setting up and they started launching. And so I think the same is true today. If we're in life, if we're in the fireworks show, if we're in the race, then it shows that at some point those past events stopped and we have started. And so if you're trying to have the collection of past events and just add up all the past events to eternity, it actually creates the problem of, in order to arrive at today, the temporal existence, we would have to traverse an infinite number of prior events, which is impossible. But the fact that we are today shows that we have not traversed an infinite number of past events. Therefore, the past is not eternal. So, anyways, these are two brief, I'm going over it quickly because I don't want to spend the brunt of the show on this. But the idea here is that when we have two different lines of philosophical arguments, and we have the scientific evidence from physics and cosmology all pointing to the beginning of the universe, then I think there's good reason to say, look, I'm not just making this up. This is not on blind faith. This is not me just finding some sort of post hoc explanation or just arguing out of ignorance and saying this is not God of the gaps. This is saying, okay, look at everything we know scientifically and philosophically. It points to the fact our universe had a beginning. And then that's where it stops. And it's interesting because in conversations that I've had with individuals after this, it's important to look to see where our presuppositions and our bias are shaping how we see the evidence, right? Where it's like, man, if this evidence over here, oh, that knockdown, so solid, absolutely. And then here's evidence over here, and we go, oh, I don't know about that. We can't really trust people. It's like, well, hold on a second. Why can we trust them over here and we can't trust them there? Unless there's a good reason, then maybe we're allowing our bias to kind of come into play, right? And the same can be said to Christians, right? Where it's like, hey, Ryan, you sure trust the physics and cosmology when it points to the beginning of the universe, but you don't trust biology when it comes to evidence, like evolution. Like, why not? And if I don't have a reason for it, then that really seems like kind of a special pleading, or just kind of a picking and choosing what sort of evidence I like, and a confirmation bias of, hey, here's evidence that confirms what I like, and I'm going to grab that, but here's evidence that I don't like, and so I'm going to reject that. And so it's important in these sort of conversations to take it on, I think, a case-by-case basis and say, okay, you're claiming the universe had a beginning. What evidence do you have for that? Why do you believe this is good evidence? And so, again, 90 minutes of the last show, which I linked to below, as well as these two arguments, I think, point to the fact our universe did have a beginning. Now, first premise is often one that's not talked about as much because it's pretty straightforward. The idea that whatever begins to exist has a cause. William Lane Craig in this chapter gives 3 reasons to believe that this premise is more reasonably true than not. And the first is that he says it's rooted in the metaphysical intuition that something cannot come from nothing. For to come into existence without a cause, or any sort of, is to come into being from nothing. To suggest that things could just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing is to quit doing serious metaphysics and to resort to magic. And again, I think this is kind of the basic intuition that we have for everything. When you hear a knock on the door, you assume someone knocked, right? Something had to cause that knock. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and they love reading the book Corduroy. And there's the part, if you know that book, where Corduroy is trying to find his button, and he climbs upstairs, and he's pulling on the buttons on the bed, and he falls off and knocks over the lamp. And the security guard doing rounds, I noticed this last night as I was thinking about this show, security guard doing rounds instantly goes, oh, someone's up there. Well, why would he assume someone's up there? Well, because things don't just go bang without a banger. Things don't just fall over without something making them fall over. There must have been an earthquake, there must have been something, or surely someone is up there. And when he goes upstairs and he finds the lamp tipped over, he's looking for someone. Right? This is the basic intuition that we have. Now, here's what I also thought was fascinating. Wait, is it on this point? Oh, no, it's on the last point. One of the objections to this is to say, and this is actually the objection that I always use. So whenever I do an atheist role play with high school students where I'm trying to challenge them, and I have videos online if you want to watch on YouTube of me doing the role play, this is the objection that I think is the strongest objection that I often use, is to say, well, look, if we look at quantum mechanics, in the quantum world, we see particles coming in and out of existence out of nothing, right? And so we see this happening all the time, so we know it can happen. Craig responds to this sort of objection and says, well, there's 2 problems with this. First of all, he says, not all physicists even agree on the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. Like, this is on that interpretation, maybe, but that's a disputed interpretation. There's other physicists trying to find different things. And so there's definitely some discussion at least here to have. But second, he says, even if the Copenhagen interpretation is true, that these particles are popping in and out of existence, he says that this indeterministic interpretation, the particles are not coming into being out of nothing. They arise as a spontaneous fluctuation of energy contained in the subatomic vacuum, which constitutes an interdeterministic cause of their orientation. And so even within this, you have a quantum vacuum. You have a vacuum space and you have energy within that space. And then these particles are coming in and out of existence spontaneously because of a fluctuation in energy. This is not the same as something coming in out of nothing. And so this idea of whatever begins to exist has a cause, and pointing to there being nothing and then our universe, right? If the beginning of our universe is the beginning of our space-time universe, then we are not just saying something like the quantum vacuum type idea. Instead, we're saying, no, there's something very different of what we mean by coming out of nothing. Number two, he says, if things really could come into being uncaused out of nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why not just anything and everything does not come into being uncaused out of nothing. So the question is, have we experienced this at any other time, or is it only the universe? And again, if it's, well, it's only the universe, well, that, again, unless we have a good reason for it, that sure seems like a special pleading argument on the side of the atheist, where it's like, well, yeah, everything else has a cause, but not the universe. Well, why not the universe? Why is that the thing that does not need a cause and can just come into existence uncaused out of nothing, but not everything else? And so this would be a good question to, again, not just saying, oh, all the atheists are special pleading, because you watch the show, you know I hate that, that argument. And say, okay, well, what reason do you have to believe the universe is different than anything and everything else? If the universe can do it, why not something else? Thirdly, and I thought this was very interesting, thirdly, he argues that this is constantly conformed by our experience. And if you're a scientific naturalist, then you have the strongest motivation to accept this. And it reminded me of a debate between William Lane Craig and Richard Dawkins, where they're talking about the reality of miracles and Christianity. And I went back and I wrote down Dawkins' quote exactly. Here's what Dawkins says. He says, if and when you're doing science, we constantly have to keep in mind that at any moment there might be a little magic trick slipped in that would completely nullify the whole enterprise of science. Right? If and when you're doing science, we constantly have to keep in mind that at any moment there might be a little magic trick, he's talking about miracle, then that would completely nullify the whole enterprise of science. And I'm curious how many atheists, and you can even put your response. I try to get responders. If you want to respond, put an R, and you can say agree or disagree. If miracles are possible, and if at any moment God could do a miracle, and if as a scientist and you're doing scientific investigation, you have to constantly keep in mind that there might be a little miracle inserted, would that nullify the whole enterprise of science? You can put a little R and say agree or disagree, yes or no. Now here's my thought in response to this. This seems exactly the case if, in fact, you believe that things can pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. Because if, let's just repeat it this way, if and when doing science, we constantly have to keep in mind that at any moment something might pop into existence out of nothing, then it would completely nullify the whole scientific enterprise of science. Right? It's like, how'd you know that bacteria really did grow in the petri dish out of the swab that you put on it? Maybe that bacteria just popped into existence out of nothing. Right? If that is a possibility, then it seems to just destroy all of science. Science is grounded on the fact of cause and effect relationships, that things do not just pop into existence out of nothing uncaused, but the thing that grew in the petri dish is there because you put the swab there, right? There's a cause and effect relationship. And so these are three reasons he offers then to support the premise that our universe that things that begin to exist has a cause. Now again, what's really important to state here is when it says whatever begins to exist has a cause, the overwhelming mistake I see by skeptics is to say, okay, well then what caused God, right? And this idea of God of the gaps, or what caused God, and the point here is that this is saying that it's only things that begin to exist have causes. If the Christian says whatever exists has a cause, well, that would be problematic because God exists, therefore he must have a cause. It's really important the fact that it's whatever begins to exist has a cause, and therefore this would not apply to God because God did not begin to exist. Now again, as William Lane Craig addresses at the very end of his chapter, and maybe I'll just switch there really quickly, he says, where does he address? Oh, he says, rather the operative causal principle in that whatever begins to exist has a cause, something that exists eternally and hence without a beginning would not need to have a cause. This is not special pleading for God, since the atheist has always maintained the same thing about the universe. It is beginningless, and uncaused. And so we just recognize, like, look, if something is eternal, then it doesn't have a cause, right? That's not special pleading. That's just saying, look, if, whatever started everything itself has to be uncaused. All right, so that is a brief overview. Now I see a ton of comments in the live chat, but only one with a Q. So I'm just going to go to the one that, I see 2 Qs. Otherwise, I don't see a Q before, like, Permaflux, thanks for being here, but I don't see any Qs there, so I don't know if you're asking me questions. So let me jump into a couple quick questions before I get to the theological implications for this. So again, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Kind of went over 3 different reasons to believe that to be true. The universe began to exist, 2 philosophical arguments, and the scientific evidence from physics and cosmology to support that conclusion. And so if those two premises are more reasonably true than not, then the conclusion logically necessarily follows that our universe did in fact begin to exist. And then we'll look at what that means here in a moment. Now, jumping over to the comments, and thank you everyone for being here. Blast Frybender, Mirza, Locades, Permanent Flux, others, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Mirza asks, what did God do before the first thing? He wasn't doing things, he was existing. And so we'll talk about that here in a moment. I don't think that God was doing stuff, because if he was doing things, then that would be a sequence of events in which then time would come into existence. And so that will be, I think, answered a little bit more here in a bit. But I think that God existed eternally as the 3 persons of the Trinity, but he wasn't necessarily doing stuff. He wasn't twiddling his thumbs in that regard. Last Frybender, thanks for being here. How does God avoid being categorized as an infinite regress as well? That'll be addressed here in just a moment with the theological implications. And so let me just push pause on that question here in a moment of how he does not fit into that infinite regress. Scanning through for more cues. Mirza again, the infinite regress is not something that you have to go through, but something that you have been through. Right, again, so that's the question, is can we even go through an infinite number of past events and arrive at the present? And the answer is no. Because in order to have gone through it, you would have to have traversed an infinite number of events before arriving at today, which means that before you could get to a day, you had to always go through another event, and therefore today would not be possible. Now, if you're going to say, no, we just add up all those past events, and that is that infinite, well, then we're coming back to this being a potential infinite, not an actual infinite. Because if we started to exist at some point and we've gone through a number of events and arrived at today, then we're just adding up over time. And he addressed that in more detail in one of the comments that I didn't get to, but it's like, hey, if you start counting at 0 and count forward, that will always be a potential infinity because you started at some point. And so you never have an actual infinite in that case. And so it's not that I have to go back and be able to go through the past infinite timeline. But the question is, can we have an actual infinite by adding up all the past events that we have gone through? Or could we have even gone through all of those events? And both of those arguments are going to argue that the fact that we exist today in the present shows that the past number of events that we have gone through had to be finite. And so that's what that argument is going to be based upon. Alrighty. All things must have a cause. So why must all things? PC Joseph says that was a joke. All things must have a cause, but God has no cause because you say so. So not all things must have a cause. I would be curious how you defend the premise or the conclusion that all things must have a cause. We recognize that caused things need causes. Contingent things rely on something else for its existence, but the question is, would we allow for necessary things to exist? Can things exist necessarily? What about other things, and we'll get to in a moment, like numbers and abstract objects, if you think that those could be possibly be real? Again, atheists have almost always throughout history have said that our universe is just eternal, it's been here forever. And so therefore they would disagree here and say, no, not all things have to be caused because our universe wasn't caused. Our universe has just been here forever. And so I would be interested to see how you would defend the conclusion, and you can call in here in a moment after I finish the theological implication, so to support your claim that all things must have a cause. All right, those are all the Q questions that I see, and so now I want to jump to the theological implications. All right, so if this conclusion is valid, all right, if we have a sound deductive argument that whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore universe has a cause, how do we get from this to God, right? What happened before the Big Bang? Or, okay, the universe had a beginning, so what? What flows from that? And here William Lane Craig talks about that we can do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe, and that enables us to recover a number of striking properties which this ultramundane cause must possess and which are theologically significant. All right, so here is his reasoning for this. Number one, he says that the first cause must be beginningless. Why? Well, since by contraposition of premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause, whatever is uncaused then did not begin to exist but has existed forever. Right? Again, this is further laid out when looking at the distinction between contingent versus necessary things. A contingent thing relies on something else for its existence. I am contingent. I rely on my parents. But if something is uncaused, is not relying on something else for its existence, then it just simply exists necessarily. And so if the cause did not, if the cause of our universe was also caused, then you would say, well, then what caused that? Then what caused that? Then what caused that? And then you would have this infinite regress of causes, which goes against the philosophical arguments. And so if the philosophical arguments against actual infinites are good, then whatever caused our universe actually then has to be uncaused, aka beginningless. And so the first characteristic or attribute he gives here is that it must be beginningless. Now, he then says, moreover, this cause must be changeless, since once more, an infinite temporal regress of changes cannot exist. And so again, this kind of goes back to the last Freibender's question. If God was changing, if God was doing stuff, also mirrors this question, then you would have an infinite regress of changes of what did God do, and then what did God do, and what did God do, and what did God do, and that would go back infinitively. And so if we recognize that if the actual infinite is impossible, that you cannot have actual infinites, then this cause, whatever it is, has to be changeless in order to not have this infinite regress of changes and therefore an actual infinite. From the changelessness then, okay, so we have a beginningless and a changeless cause. From the changelessness of the first cause, its immateriality follows. Craig argues, for whatever is material involves incessant change on at least a molecular or atomic level. But the uncaused first cause exists in a state of absolute changelessness. And so, again, you could also argue that if this cause created the entire space-time universe, if the cause was the beginning of all material stuff, then itself, it cannot be made of material stuff. And so I think there's two reasons to believe that the first cause has to be immaterial. Is not only if it's made up of material stuff, you now have material changes, which then leads to an actual infinite, which is impossible, but also if it's made of material stuff, well, no, it's a creator of all material stuff, and therefore it can't be material itself. Just like if I said, I gave birth to myself, it's like, well, you can't, because you first have to exist to be able to do that. But then I guess I'm a guy, and so I'm not giving birth to anyone anyways. So, immateriality follows. Now, continuing on, so we have a beginningless, changeless, immaterial cause. He then says, given some relational theory of time, the uncaused cause must therefore be timeless, at least sans the universe, or without the universe. You can't really say, I put it in my thumbnail, before the universe or before the beginning. Well, if the universe is the beginning of time, then there is no before, since that's a temporal word. So without the universe or sans the universe, since in the utter absence of events, time would not exist. And so again, if you have a timeless, a changeless, immaterial state, and you have no additional adding up of events, then therefore you do not have time, and therefore you are in a timeless state. So the first cause would have to be timeless. It follows then that this cause must also be spaceless, since it is both immaterial and timeless, and no spatial entity can be both immaterial and timeless. He writes, if an entity is immaterial It could exist in space only in virtue of being related to material things in space. But then it could not be timeless since it undergoes extrinsic changes in its relations to material things. Hence, the uncaused first cause must transcend both time and space and be the cause of their origination. And so again, if you now have a timeless cause, then that also means a spaceless cause because it's not existing within space, and so that leads to whatever this cause is has to transcend time and space itself. Almost done with the list. Such a being must, moreover, be enormously powerful, since it brought the entirety of physical reality, including all matter and energy in space-time itself, into being without any material cause. So again, if you're going to create an entire universe, cause an entire universe to come into existence, there has to be an enormous power involved there. And finally, and most remarkably, such a transcendent cause is plausibly taken to be personal. Why personal? And this is, I remember one of the first times I gave a lecture on the Kalam Cosmological argument. This was the big pushback that I get of why personal. And here Craig gives two reasons, I believe, or three reasons why personal. The first is this, and I think this is what to me was really helpful. Why God? Why not something else? Three reasons. There are two types of causal explanations. He writes that there are scientific explanations and there are agent or personal explanations. So example, and I've mentioned similar things on the show before because John Lennox talks about this, but if you walk in a room and a kettle of water is boiling, a pot of water is boiling on the stove, you can say, why is the water boiling? And you can give a scientific explanation of the heat of the flame heating up the metal, which then produces a reaction and the molecules and blah, blah, blah. Or you can say, well, I want a cup of, a bowl of soup. I'm making soup, right? So there is the personal agent explanation and there is a scientific explanation for why is the water boiling. And he then says, now a first state of the universe cannot have a scientific explanation since there is nothing before it, and therefore it cannot be accounted for in the terms of the laws operating on initial conditions. It can only be accounted for in terms of an agent and his volitions, a personal explanation. So the argument here again is, okay, if we have two different types of explanations, scientific and personal, but when we're talking about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial state of which the universe did not exist, well, then you cannot give a scientific explanation of that because no physical universe or laws are functioning at that time, and therefore, if there's no scientific explanation, the only other explanation left is a personal explanation. That would be his first reason why the cause must be personal. Second, he talks about the personal cause is because if we look at what is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, what fits that description, you either have, again, two things. You either have an immaterial, beginningless, uncaused, spaceless being, and this would be either an unembodied mind or an abstract object. Abstract objects like numbers, sets, propositions, and properties are typically construed by philosophers who include such things in their ontology as being precisely the sort of entities which exist necessarily, timelessly, and spacelessly. However, we recognize that no abstract object can be the cause or origin of our universe because abstract objects are not involved in causal relations. And so if the only two things that exist that fit the description of the first cause, being a beginningless, timeless, spaceless, changeless thing, is numbers, abstract objects, or disembodied minds, and abstract objects do not have a causal relationship to be able to cause a universe to come into existence, well, now we're left with a disembodied or an unembodied mind being the other option, which again, therefore, leads us to a personal explanation. Thirdly, he says the same conclusion is also implied by the fact that only personal free agency can account for the origin and first temporal effect on a changeless cause. And so we say, well, how do we go from nothingness to a universe, right? How do we have this this question of how can a first event come to exist if the cause of the event exists changelessly and eternally? Right, and this is one of the things that I'd heard when I was, responded to the objection when I first gave this argument is, if our universe is eternally sub-zero, well then water that exists there is going to be eternally frozen. Right, if you go from water to ice, then you know that at some point there had to be a change. But if you have the same eternal effect, sub-zero temperatures, then you're going to have the same eternal result, frozen liquid, or frozen, water. You have ice. If you go from water to ice, if you have a change, then the question is, well, how can this first event come into exist if the cause of that event exists changelessly and eternally? Right? Does that make sense? That the cause of what makes water freeze, if that cause, being sub-zero, is changeless and eternal, then the event, ice, will always be ice. But if you go into something coming into exist from water to ice, then the question is, what changed it? And he argues then the best way out of this dilemma is agent causation, whereby an agent freely brings about some event into the absence of prior determining conditions. Because the agent is free, he can initiate new effects by freely bringing about conditions which are not previously present. And so if you allow for a personal, unembodied mind that is free, then that free being can make a decision that then produces a change. And so while God is eternal, the cause, God being the cause of our universe, is eternal. His effect is not eternal because he made a free choice to create. And then that led to the creation of our universe. And so this is where the conclusion ends, and I will take your calls and your questions. But if everything that begins to exist has a cause, and our universe had a beginning and began to exist, then our universe did have a cause. If that argument is sound, and if this conceptual analysis goes through, then premise 4 would say, if the universe had a cause, then an uncaused, personal creator of the universe exists, who sans the universe without the universe, is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. And then based on premises 3 and 4, the universe began to exist, or the universe has a cause, and then what I just read. Therefore, the conclusion would be, an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who without the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. And again, this is not a clear pointing to Christianity or the Christian God, but this is saying that, look, if our universe truly did begin to exist, and all of time, space, and matter came into being at some point in time, then whatever caused it has to have these properties. Now, what fits that description? And this is why we can look at scientific evidence within philosophical arguments that have theological implications. So that's everything I wanted to say. And my voice is dry. So again, if you are listening and want to join the show and chat with me, use that link that I pinned at the top and join the conversation. If not, let me go back to the last cue that I saw and continue taking your questions. Mirza says there's no logical reason why you cannot have an infinite regress. It's just that your mind can't comprehend it. So I even said, you're right, it's not a logical reason. Well, it's logically possible to have this actual infinite. The point is it metaphysically possible? And it's not that I can't comprehend it. I have given philosophical reasons why it can't be true. And so if you think it can be true, I would love to hear your argumentation for why it can be true. But to just tell me that my brain can't comprehend it, that I'm not just smart enough, or we're not smart enough to make sense of it, again, this seems like this is naturalism of the gaps. Right? This is like, well, I believe something that I don't have, it's like atheists often are like, we are evidentially driven. We believe things based on evidence and what's true. And it's like, okay, here's the philosophical arguments and scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. And the response is, well, it's probably infinite. We just can't comprehend it. Well, if I can't comprehend something, then that means I have no good reason to believe it to be infinite. So the question is, to the atheist, my pushback to you, Mirza, is why do you believe that it is infinite if you don't have reason for it? And your argument is, well, we just can't understand it. That seems to be an appeal to ignorance. Seems to be, we don't know, therefore it's infinite. Why not just accept that philosophical and scientific evidence pointing to a beginning of the universe? Is it because a beginning of our universe points to a beginner, and this argument starts to have weight and points to a God? Is it like Alexander Vilenkin said, we now face the problem of a cosmic beginning. We can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. Cosmologists now have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Why is it a problem? Well, because a beginning points to beginner. So this would, I'm just curious, and Mears and I, we've had a lot of conversations, but the question is, if you can't comprehend it, and if you don't have reason for it, then the question is, why hold that view? And so that would be my question to you. All right, James is here in the chat, so I'll remove you from the green room. And James, welcome to the show. Can you hear me, James?
No, hey there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, but I don't know why your audio is coming through my computer and not my headset. That might make things echo. So give me a second. Let me change this audio. All right, now it says I'm live again. All right, now it says I'm live again, or I'm live again. All right, James, can you hear me?
Yeah, and the quality of your voice did change while you were messing with things.
Yeah, well, I realized when your audio came through my computer that it was because my computer never recognized my microphone or my headphones, and therefore it was picking up my voice through my computer, and therefore I just spent the last 50 minutes talking to people without my decent mic. So sorry about that, everybody. All right, so James, thanks for calling in, and what's on your mind?
Just to let you know, you sounded perfectly fine.
Okay, good.
It didn't have the higher level of professional quality to the sound, but it was perfectly acceptable for a live stream.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
No regrets there. And interestingly, I'm waiting for my new microphone to show up. I'm tracking UPS as we speak, and it's like 3 stops away.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I'm talking at a $10 microphone myself. So,
okay.
Really quick, I was making comments in chat really so I can keep track of what my thoughts were, because you're covering a lot of territory with this conversation. You're making a lot of points, and I have a couple of problems with some of it.
Okay.
I don't think abstract objects exist. I've heard some philosophers argue that it does, and I personally reject the premise. I think it's unreasonable. But I don't think that that's a necessary point to the discussion, right? That's just kind of a side point, like a side issue, unless you think it's important.
Well, I think it's important that, right. So if there is a beginningless, timeless, changeless, immaterial cause of our universe, the only things that could possibly fit that category would be unembodied minds or abstract objects. That's the argument. Now, if you're going to say, well, I don't even think abstract objects exist, well, then that seems to leave unembodied minds as the only option. And it just deletes one of those options rather than having to go through and show why abstract objects don't have the ability to cause our universe. So I think whether they exist or not, it can be shown that they're probably not the best alternative in being the ones that caused our universe to exist.
Sure, that's fine. Well, this simplifies the discussion then, so we can move forward. Personal, you said it needs to be a personal cause, and I'm not sure what personal means in the context.
Personal being the result of a mind, of a being who has free will and the ability to make choices. So just like the personal cause being why is the water boiling on the stove? Well, you can give a scientific explanation or a personal explanation. The explanation is, well, I want this. And so the personal explanation would be God as a being making a free will choice to create. That would be the personal explanation.
Or even if it only made a choice to create, even if it didn't necessarily have free will, but merely had will and acted upon the will, we could still call that personal, right?
Sure, I think so.
All right, that's fine, and we can move past that point then. My understanding of what cosmologists say about the beginning of the universe is that the statement that they're making, or that they're intending to make with that, is not the same way that William Lane Craig means it when he says that the universe began to exist, right? When he sorted the Border Blank and Guth paper, I'm sure you've seen the debate where Sean Carroll brought in a recording of Alan Guth, right? And he explained what he meant in the paper. What he meant was when they talk about the beginning of the universe, they're talking about the beginning of the unfolding of the structure of the universe as we know it. In other words, the beginning of the classical descriptions of the universe. They're not talking about necessarily an absolute beginning to all time and space and whatever, right? They're leaving that as a possibility, but they just don't know anything at all about the universe before the beginning of rapid expansion. Like they know nothing about it before, because as far as they know, physics breaks down before that. And so they don't have an opportunity to really examine whatever or do math to figure out what was happening before rapid expansion. They don't have a way to. And with that being the case, again, William Lane Craig, when he says something like the universe began to exist, he definitely means it differently than cosmologists mean it when they say it. Now, he could still be correct, but William Lane Craig himself has admitted that his idea of the Kalam in this context requires that his understanding of time being very linear, being a straight arrow of progression, it has to make certain assumptions that he can't really know for sure, right? For example, if we have block time, if it's not a linear real time thing, if that's an illusion, and if block time is really the nature of time, then his theory just doesn't hold anymore, and we just don't know the answer to that. And
What do you
William
mean?
Lane Craig, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, what do you mean we don't know the answer to that? Do you think that there are arguments that can be made to lend to one theory of time being more likely true than a different theory of time, or do you think it's just completely unanswerable question and both of them are equally plausible?
I mean, I favor the block time model. I don't. I think that we're experiencing time within the block, and that the stuff that we call the past is happening in a present tense for people that are in those spaces of the block, and that the events that we say haven't happened yet technically have, because there were people there experiencing that frame of time, and for them that's the now, and our sense of this linear arrow is just an illusion that we're experiencing. And so, for example, since forever, you and I have always been having this conversation at this moment. Always, right? And I don't know that that's true, but that's my intuition on the issue. I'm not a
Yeah.
cosmologist.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always wanted to do a show on that because I think that there's probably, I forget how many I've come up with over the years, but like 4 or 5 different arguments I would have against the block theory of time or B theory of time that I think are in my opinion strong defeaters, to where I would be a very adamant proponent of an A theory of time for certain reasons. And so, but he addresses in his chapter that, yeah, if B theory of time is true, well then, yeah, here's what you got. And here's some objections that go through. But Craig as well would argue strongly against a B theory of time in favor of A theory, which then, therefore those objections are no longer strong because you've disproven or offered defeaters against that objection.
Sure. And I think A theory of time is the predominant theory, if I understand it correctly. It doesn't appeal to my intuitions the same as the B theory does. And,
Sure.
there's not really a point to argue there. I'm just saying that it's a reason why your structure of ideas, it's one of the points in that structure that don't hold for me personally, but I don't think of it as a defeater to your theory, right? Your entire presentation or structure of ideas. It's just a reason why it doesn't resonate for me as necessarily convincing.
Yeah.
But there's nothing probably more we can do with that other than me saying so.
Well, that would be fun to do it because, like I said, I've always wanted for the last couple of years. I've wanted to do a show on that topic, and I just haven't done it. And so maybe that's something I should do this summer when I have a spare week. Is offer my 4 or 5 reasons why I think B theory is false, and then open up for conversations. But because again, and you're right here, is that there are. I mean, this conversation can be way more in depth than simply a 30-minute overview on YouTube, because there are a lot of other presuppositions that kind of come in and offshoot conversations that need to be had as well.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's fair enough. So again, this is why I'm not offering any of this as a defeater to what you're saying. I'm just. Oh, hold on 1 second. I got a different um, I got a different stream opening. Hold on 1 second. Let me pull this tab away real quick and close the rest of my Google. There we go. Now I got it, because I had a different tab that started projecting to me. So the next thing that I wanted to ask or make a comment about really quick is this idea of infinite regression. Because as I understand it, thoughts are events, and thoughts are a change in mind state. And because of this, if we say that a God has always existed since forever, and they've always been consciously sentient, which is what it would mean to exist in any meaningful way, then we're talking about a God whose mental universe, right, the phenomenon of his thought processes, are a series of events, a sequence of events that represents an infinite regression of events within himself. And so I don't really think that the God theory, as I understand it, it works around the problem or manages to avoid the problem of infinite regression.
Yeah, and I there was a section on that, and I wish I had a better response because that was one section that I don't remember the response to.
But do you understand the point that I'm making?
I understand the point is if God had a thought and then he had another thought and then he had another thought, you now have time and therefore you have an infinite number of thoughts as he's existed infinitely and therefore you would have actual infinites. Is that the argument?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that just comes to mind is the idea of our conceptual reality is different than that which is actualized, right? And so just like I can conceive of a hotel with an infinite number of rooms is very different than being able to actualize a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And so the question is there a different category for our mental thoughts and what we are able to conceptualize than when we are talking about being able to instantiate this into the physical world? Because what we're talking about with arguments against actual infinities is we're talking about physical infinities of past events happening throughout all of eternity. And so the question is there a different category for our mental space where our thoughts have to be instantiated or actualized into the physical world? And that's what the argument is speaking about, is an actual infinity, not the ability to conceive of some sort of infinity.
Sure, I understand that. But if we're talking about an actual God that has actual thoughts, I think we still have to call that an actual infinity and not a conceptual infinity. But this is just my thinking on this. Now, my thinking could be kind of off the rails in a way that I'm not perceiving,
Yeah.
right?
And
I'm
again,
not.
and this is, oh yeah, go for it.
No, go ahead.
Well, and I think this is something I would love to spend more time on because I know that I've heard other answers out there that is just not coming to my mind right now. But again, I would say there's a difference between, well, my thoughts are actual, right? I actually had a thought. The question is, I had a thought of, I don't know, and this may be a stupid example, but I had a thought of a unicorn. Does that mean that unicorn actually exists? And the answer is no, unicorns are not actual. That is conceptual. But so my thought was real. I did have an actual thought of a unicorn, but the unicorn didn't actually exist. Right. In the same way, I can have a thought, my thought of Hilbert's Hotel, of a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. That is a real thought. It's an actual thought. But that hotel cannot be instantiated or actualized into the real world. And so there is a disconnect. While that thought is real and God does have real thoughts, the question is there a disconnect between the thought and being able to instantiate or actualize those thoughts? And that is what we are talking about with an actual infinite, is we're talking about infinites instantiated existing in the real world that would be required if our physical universe were eternal. And so I think that's what it's pointing against is the infinite regress of a physical universe. And that's why then one of the theological implications is saying God must be immaterial, because a material being has moving molecules and things, which then would create time and would lead to actual infinites. But a disembodied or unembodied mind, not having physical parts that are moving and changing, therefore it could exist timelessly and therefore infinitely without occurring, is that the right word? Instantiating an actual infinite.
I don't think we're really evading the problem, but I understand what you're telling me on the point. And part of the issue for me is the idea of supernatural. It doesn't seem to mean anything at all. My understanding of the physical might not be what a cosmologist would say. I'm not sure, but my understanding is any kind of energy doing any kind of thing. Right. This is physical because it's governed. It's going to be governed by some kind of properties to give it coherence, to give it function. And so even if the properties that govern it, the function of those particles or waves or whatever phenomenon is happening, might be completely different than what's governing the behavior of us at a quantum level, at a cellular level, whatever. It might, a different kind of energy governed by different principles, whatever. It's still going to, anything that exists in reality would have to exist of some form of energies doing and functioning in some form of way. Because if we say, oh no, it doesn't require any energy, then I don't know what it means to be all powerful. There's no energy involved. If we say it doesn't require any space, then I don't know what it means to say that it exists in reality if it doesn't exist anywhere. And if
Yeah.
we say that, and the problem goes down the line. And so it seems like, to my ears, to my mind, Christians are accidentally defining God out of existence in order to keep him removed from scrutiny. Does that make any sense?
Oh, absolutely. That makes total sense. I think that's why it's so important, I think, in these conversations for Christians and atheists to recognize that we often have different meaning for the same words that we use. Right.
Yeah.
So you said something to the effect, and correct me if I'm wrongly remembering, you said something to the effect of, when I hear supernatural, I hear like not real. Right. You said something,
Well,
unless you said something different.
to clarify, I don't
Yeah.
think supernatural means anything at all. It's like it's a placeholder. So the speaker that's invoking supernatural is talking to somebody else, and they're saying, "You've got this concept called natural, right? About actual energetic phenomenon doing, existing in time and space. I've got this rival concept that totally isn't that, and it's in this box." And the box is labeled supernatural. And my response is, I'd like to see inside that box. I'd like to examine the concept that you hold in your mind, that you're giving a name to, called supernatural. I'd like to examine it and see what the heck it even means. And the response is always, "Oh, you can't look in the box. I can't either. It's locked. I have no idea what this is." Right?
Yeah. Right. And so I think that's the point, is right. And this is why, okay, going back to the point I was trying to make, is why it's so important to recognize the meaning that we have for certain words, right? When I say supernatural, I have something that means to me. And when an atheist hears supernatural, that means something often very different. And, I've even had conversations with other atheists where, like, what is faith? He pointed to Hebrews 11, where it says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the things unseen. He goes, unseen means not real. And so you're by definition, because unseen is defined as not real, therefore your faith is in something not real. And I go, okay, you have a very different meaning for unseen than what I would mean for unseen, right? And so in a supernatural box, I would put angels, demons, God, our mind. These are disembodied or non-physical realities. So I think there's the physical world and there's a non-physical world. And so the question is, in my mind, not that you can't look in the box. Well, in one sense, you can't look in it, because if it's something not physical, you can't stick it under a microscope and look at it. But the question in my mind would be, can we use philosophical arguments and thought experiments to look inside the box and see that a mind does actually exist and is not the same as your brain? And if so, if I can make an argument for the existence of the mind, of the soul, and that not being something physical that exists, well, I may not be able to see the soul because it's not physical to be seen. I can say that the soul then exists inside that box, and there is a description of the supernatural, or the non-physical would include angels, demons, souls, God.
Right. So to clarify my position on that, I'm not saying. See, when you say that there's examples and you list it, the mind, angels, demons, gods, whatever, as things that are in the box, we're having a little bit of a misunderstanding, and I want to clear that up real
Okay.
quick. Those are examples of things that you want to call supernatural. But what I'm talking about as being in the box isn't examples of supernatural things. I'm talking about the definition of what supernatural even means. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so would a definition like beyond natural or not made of physical stuff be a definition
Right.
that then would work for you?
The reason it wouldn't, it would be like saying not marshmallow. I know a bunch of things that aren't marshmallow. Well, you're just telling me what it isn't. You're not telling me what it is, right? I need you to tell me. If you have a rival concept, if you're like, there are entities that exist in reality that don't consist of any form of energy in doing any kind of a thing, don't exist in time, don't exist in space. Again, my mind says you just defined it out of existence, but setting that aside, I'm like, okay, I'll bite. how are you defining supernatural? And the
Yeah.
answer is always, I don't know. I have a list of things I think are supernatural. I'm calling them that, but I don't know how to define it except by telling you what it isn't, which
So
doesn't tell me what it is.
okay, yeah. So let me ask you this: the analogy of not marshmallow, and you go, well, yeah, there's a lot of things that aren't marshmallow. So what is it? It's like, well, that's true, because a marshmallow is one very specific thing, and it doesn't necessarily have an opposite. Now, what if I told my son, hey son, this rock is hard, and he goes, what's hard mean? And I go, well, it's not soft. Like, does that have more meaning than saying not marshmallow? Because to say something is not soft, or to say, hey, my shirt is not wet. Like if I tell anyone my shirt is not wet, you automatically go, oh, it's dry. Because we have
Right.
this sort of dichotomy versus if I said, this item I'm holding is not a marshmallow, you go, well, then I have no idea what it is because it could literally be anything else, not a marshmallow. But if I could
Right.
say, hey, James, guess what my shirt is? And I'm going to give you a hint. It's not wet. You can be pretty confident that the answer is it's dry because that does have a dichotomy there. And so I think when we look at loud or quiet, hard or soft, wet and dry, things that are these properties that we understand that have opposites, to say something is not
Right.
quiet, that means it's loud. To say it's not loud, it means it's quiet.
Sure.
And that does make more sense. And so I think if physical and non-physical function in the same way, to say, well, it's not physical stuff, then therefore it becomes a non-physical. And that I think has more meaning than not marshmallow.
Right. So the reason that something like hard would have meaning is because I don't need to define it by what it isn't. Right. When I talk about hard, what I'm saying is that when physical pressure is applied to it, it gives great resistance. It either doesn't budge at all, or it is difficult to be able to move it, to alter the shape of it, to be able to push into the shape of it. Right. And so I don't even need to define what soft is in order to explain what hard is. The same thing with dry versus wet. I can explain these independently of their opposite. Whereas with supernatural, I'm still left with a non concept. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a way of saying it's not the thing that you're talking about, but I can't tell you what it actually is. And so it feels like a completely fruitless conversation. It's a placeholder, it's a wild card. It's I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm reserving a place for me to say it. And it just feels like that's why the conversation can't go anywhere with it.
Yeah. And I'd be curious if there's a better definition than what I'm offering. And I'm happy I would look into that. I just don't think I guess I just wouldn't see it the same way as just being a placeholder, because of the understanding of, we know of what it means for something to be physical and therefore to be non-physical is it's not made of physical stuff. And that does give us an idea of what things are. And then we can look at, for example, like with a soul, with a mind, we can look at, okay, we have experience, we have firsthand experience of it. We think thoughts and we have thoughts, and we can be able to conceptualize or think about the mind in that sense. And therefore, if God is an unembodied mind, then we have something that we can make sense of. That it's not just simply the negation or just saying what he is not. So I'd be happy to look into further definitions, but I think that's why it is important in this conversation between, atheists and Christians or whatever, is to think about the meaning that we attribute to words and what we mean by them. And often when we say something that has meaning to one person, it means something very different to someone else. And I think this is a good example of what does supernatural actually mean.
All right, yeah, that's fine. We can kind of stick a pin in that and kind of follow up on it later at some point.
Sure.
In the meantime, I want to clarify that I'm not completely satisfied with my material worldview. It's not that I think that there's something not material. I don't even think that's a concept. It's that when I think about the smallest scale of things, protons, neutrons, electrons, we picture these little static fields, or we picture little spheres floating around each other. My question is, well, what are those made out of? And if you could tell me, I'd be like, well, then what's that made out of? Right? At some point, we have this paradoxical nature of existence itself, where it doesn't make any sense that anything exists, but it does, right? So if I say the universe has always existed in some form, I'm not really satisfied with that answer. And if you tell me that God must have always existed, I'm not satisfied with that either. Not because I reject the idea of something always existing. Something must have always existed, or else nothing would probably exist now. But in any event, no matter what the base of it is, no matter what the eternally always existed thing is, it still is paradoxical. It does not satisfy my mind to say that anything or anyone has always existed, and yet I recognize that something or somebody must have always existed. And so, I'm not saying that I have all the answers, or even that I'm satisfied with my worldview. I'm saying that if I'm going to be converted to a different way of thinking about the nature of reality, I'm probably going to need more than what I'm being offered.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I guess what comes to my mind is, I wonder, you've used the phrase a few times, like, it doesn't satisfy my mind.
Yeah.
And I wonder how often my mind is not satisfied by something, yet it is still true at the same time. Right.
Sure.
And therefore, what am I going back to as understanding the nature of truth? Is it, what does it satisfy me most? And there are times I'm like, I'm really satisfied by this answer, and so I think it must make sense. But is it possible for things that are not true to satisfy me? And is it possible for things that are true to not satisfy me? And so then, is there a deeper kind of form of epistemology, of way of knowing what is true, to go back to not just what does this answer satisfy me, but what has arguments and evidence pointing to certain conclusions? And that's what I often want to be curious about. But
Right, absolutely. But the reason this is relevant, last point, and I promise I'll get off here
yeah,
and let you go forward with that.
yeah,
This all comes back to the idea, or my position, that people don't get to choose what they believe. We we move into states of perception based on how we're impressed. In other words, how we're satisfied with arguments and evidence and experience and things like that. And we don't get to choose. Like, if I wanted to arbitrarily choose that tiny people live in my refrigerator, pretty sure that's not going to make any god mad for me to believe tiny people live in my refrigerator, but I still couldn't do it, no matter how much I
right,
wanted to.
right.
It's a thought experiment. I would need to be satisfied with reasons to think such a thing is true, and this is where satisfaction becomes important.
Yeah, no, and I fully agree with you, right? And I don't think that we are just freely able to choose, right? And I often, you give the example of, like, I want you to believe right now, whoever's watching on YouTube, that there's a pink elephant standing right behind my left shoulder. Like, choose to believe that, and no one can,
Right.
because there is no
Right.
pink elephant standing behind my shoulder. It's just, you can't just believe whatever you want. However, I think our choices do have are influenced by our thoughts and by our decisions, because we often choose what evidence we're willing to look at. We're often allowing our bias to come into play. And I think there's ways in which our choices do affect us, and what we're willing to look at and not look at, and what we're willing to be persuaded by and not be persuaded by. But I fully agree with you. And I think I gave this example when this was happening, is I was trying to get a job. In order to have a certain job, I needed a certain view on the book of Revelation that I didn't hold. Everything in me wanted this job. And I wanted the job, and I'm like, all I have to do is say, I believe this view on the book of Revelation. I'm like, but I can't say that because I know it's a lie. And I can't just change my view and say, okay, I now hold that view. I'm like, because I don't. I had to, but here's where I think it comes in. But because of my desire to want the job, I listened to debate after debate after debate, and I called people and I talked to people, and I said, what are all the objections you have against my view? What are all your reasons for your view? I want to hear you answer all the objections I have against your view. And I went through this, journey of a few months, to where I got to the point where I went, okay, I can see how that view could be true. I'm not completely sold, but I am, okay, I'm open to it, because I've actually done some deep investigation with an open mind, and actually desire to want to believe it. But I fully agree with you that you can't just choose it, or else I would have just said, okay, I switched my view. It's like, well, I can't.
Right.
I actually had to go about the act of being persuaded. But if I did not want to be persuaded, I would never have done that investigation. Or if I didn't actually have an open mind, then I would have done the investigation with only trying to prove myself. And I would have come out of that saying, look, I investigated and I was right. That view is wrong.
Right.
And so I think that our bias and our feelings and our desires absolutely play a role in our open-mindedness as we investigate. And if we're even open and willing to be, to go where the evidence leads, comes into play. And that's where I think our own personal desires do influence. Well, I can't just believe whatever I want. It's not completely deterministic either.
Right, that makes sense.
So
Well, thank you for this conversation and for engaging with me on this level.
absolutely. Thanks for chatting with me, James. It's always fun.
I'll talk to you soon.
All right. See ya. All right, Mirza, you've been waiting forever. Good to have you back.
No
How
worries.
you doing?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. So, yeah, oh my God, I have so many objections, but to go back to infinite regress, like, if I understand your argument against it, you're saying infinite regress would take infinite time, therefore we would never get to present. Therefore, it cannot be true.
Well, you could not traverse an actual infinite number of past events in order to arrive at today.
It would take you an infinite amount of time to do that.
Right, which means that today would never happen because you have to, there's always another.
No, because you have infinite past to do that. That's the infinity. You're thinking infinity as a quantity that you can add. It's more of a concept. The reason you cannot understand infinity is because your brain only has 80 billion cells, right? Your brain can only understand finite things because it's a finite brain. But we can do infinite math. We can. Are you saying like are numbers infinite?
Well,
you're saying infinity doesn't exist, right? But numbers are infinite, right?
So you can conceptualize infinite numbers, but the question is, can it be actualized? And so when we're talking about time, the reason why it's not just, as you mentioned, I think a concept, but it is more like functioning like a counting of numbers, is we're talking about past events, which are actual things that have taken place. Where I said this, and before I talked to you, I talked to James, and before James was this. And so you're actually counting up real events. And so the question is, it's not just a concept. We're talking about, can I have gone through an infinite number of real events and arrive at today if I have to traverse an infinite number in order to do so? And the answer is no. If you have traversed it.
Why not? Why not?
Because if you have traversed it, then that means at some point you finished, and you can never finish an infinity because there's always an infinite more in order to do.
Right. And it's infinite. There's no contradiction there. It's past is infinite and will take you infinite amount of time to traverse it. It's not starting from some point and adding infinity, therefore you can never get here. It's starting from here and going back infinite. You know what
So if we're starting here and going back, then that's not an actual infinite, that's a potential, because you have a starting point. Because you have a starting point. Adding up a collection of successive things is not an actual infinite.
No, but in terms of is it possible that time has always existed? I see no logical reason why not. I mean, from what you're saying, it doesn't feel real to you or something, but mathematically it makes sense, right?
Well, I never brought in feelings into this conversation. What I'm trying to say, but you even said, in order to traverse an infinite past number of events, it would take you infinity to do. So if it would take you, if it would take you an infinite amount of time to do, then you would never finish because you have to go for an infinite amount of time.
Or
the fact
you
that
never started, right? So basically you cannot, if you wanted to account for everything in the past, in the infinite past, it would take you an infinite future. That's what you're saying. Therefore, it cannot. Well, no, infinity, right? I mean, just because.
Well, what I'm so
you see
I think
what
it's
I'm
what
saying?
I'm saying. Yeah, but I think so. I think what I'm saying is slightly different. Is I'm saying, if today actually exists, if you and I are talking in the present, then that means the present is not in the past. The present is now, which means we have traversed the past to get to the present. And so if what you said is true, that in order to traverse an infinite past would take you all of an infinity, then you would never be able to say we traversed it and we arrived at today. The fact that we arrive at today means that we have finished traversing the past in order to get to today. But if it is going to take you all of infinity to get through an infinite number of past events, then the present would never arrive. That's the argument. The fact that the present arrived means that we got through the past.
You seem to be, when you say we have to that assumes a starting point. But that's the thing. There's no starting point to past. There's no, we started from here and we got here.
So
It's a mind bending. It's a mind bending thing, but it does. It's not something you can wrap your mind, but it makes mathematical sense. It's like what if there was a first moment, if time did begin, then what was there before, right? You can always think of something before, and you can do that infinitely. But if you start thinking, well, if we did that, we would never finish. Well, no, because past is infinite by definition.
okay, so let me ask two questions. So first, you said, I forget exactly. I wrote down the other point you made, that there's not a starting point. So think about my analogy of running a race. If there's never a starting point, will the runners ever be running the race?
Wait a minute. So no, right? That's what kind of analogy is that? Seriously.
Okay.
We are not talking about a race that you're not. Are you asking when did the time start? Is that what your analogy is about?
So if time has started,
yes,
and they are running a race and they can cross a finish line, if that's a real destination, if they can cross, then that means at some point they started the race and they are running and time is now moving forward. And so if we live in a universe in which time is moving forward, then that implies, like that race, if we are moving forward down the track, then at some point we had to start. If what you're saying is true, and that if in an infinite past there is never a starting point, then if we never started, then time can never be moving forward, and therefore we would never arrive at today, which is the point in time as we move forward through time.
So you're saying we have to have started in order to be moving?
In order for there to be a yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we are moving through. If a theory of time is true, and this goes back to the conversation with James, as a theory of time is true, then that points to we are moving through time, and there's a past, there's a present, there's a future, and that implies there's a starting point to time. Which, if there was because to have without a starting point, you have no moving through time. If you never started, just like if you never start, if you never start if you don't start a stopwatch, then you don't ever have time running.
But we're not talking about stopwatch. We're talking about time.
Right.
You're using analogies of things that start to understand things that doesn't start.
All right, that's good. So how do we count time then? How do we measure time in your view?
Right. Well, with like watches, I suppose, or days of week, but that's just how we measured it. That's not right. That doesn't mean there can be no infinite regress of events.
So I think often people define time as the succession of events, right? So you have one event followed by another event, and that's how you count time. And so again, if you're going to have events taking place, then that is moving through time. If you have, I did this, then I did that, that is a way of showing that time has taken place. That's temporal language that then implies a theory, at least, or some sort of view that time is real and we are moving through time, which means if you're moving through it, at some point you had to start moving through it. If you never started, and that's why I think the stopwatch analogy is true, is if I hold up my phone with a stopwatch, if I never hit start, I'm never going to start moving through the time. I'm never going to have events taking place.
You keep using start.
Yeah.
Why you keep saying start?
Well, because if our universe never had a beginning, and if things
time,
never
not universe, time. Could there be an infinite regress of events? Basically, that's the question, right? Could there be something that happened before something else that happened before something else, going back to forever? Right.
Okay,
and
so that's what I'm trying to.
Why not? Yeah. Right.
So that's the whole point. Is if you have an infinite number of past events that have to happen before we get to today, then we would never get to today.
Why not?
Because as you even said, you would have to traverse an infinite number of things, which would take all of infinity to do, and therefore you would never finish.
Right.
Okay. So if you would never finish,
it would take you an infinity to traverse infinity, and it matches, right? Infinite past, infinite time. It works. It mathematically works.
So you would always be in the past. You'd never get through the past. Therefore, the present would never be here.
Why would you be in the past if you already been through the past?
Well, okay. So correct me if I'm wrong. You said it would take you an infinite amount of time to get through it, which means you would never actually get through it. Now you just switch and said, well, why would you be in it if you've been through it? Well, you wouldn't get through it.
Right. You've been through infinite paths before. Yeah. The thing is, you're thinking in terms of quantity. You know the one Achilles and the turtle.
No.
You know, saw or whatever it is. There's a turtle, I don't know, a mile away, and Achilles is very fast. But by the time he gets to where the turtle has moved a little bit. And by the time he gets to that point, he has moved a little bit more, and so on, right? So how can Achilles ever catch a turtle? You know that. You heard that probably before. So
Okay.
so the problem is it treats time. It treats your thoughts as time instead of actual time. The truth is, Achilles takes this much time to reach, and then less, and then less, and less, and it's a limit, right? It limits to some value. Same here. You're thinking, well, if I keep thinking these thoughts, it will take infinite amount. Yes, your thoughts will take infinite amount of time. That's not the events themselves. These things already happen. It's just that your brain cannot wrap your head around the infinity. This is so big. How can it ever start? Basically, that's your thing.
So again, I think that's very unfair. I think it's very unfair to just say we can't understand it, and the only reason you believe what you believe is that you just can't understand it. When I am giving,
no, we cannot. I can understand it. I can understand it. Right. I'm saying you're trying to approach it intuitively. But you're saying it takes infinite amount of time. Past is infinite. There you go, right? I mean, it works. There's no contradiction there. There's no. And the other thing is, if there was a first thing, then what was there before first thing, right? You can, just like numbers, you can always add something before and then add something before. Why would that ever stop?
Because it would stop if the first thing is a necessary thing in which nothing was ever before it, because that is the eternal thing. And that's what atheists often attribute to the universe.
And then the universe was the first thing for infinity.
Well, in a Christian view, it'd be God.
And he did nothing for infinite amount of time, and then he decided to make the universe.
Well, it would have been a timeless state, so there's not an infinite amount of time. It was timeless because there was not a succession of events, and then then he created the universe, and that is the beginning of time.
Why do you need a God then? You just say universe started, and that's the beginning of time.
Well, that's the whole cosmological argument that I gave. So if our universe started, then whatever started our universe by definition would have to be.
It started at the beginning of time, right? Just like God did nothing before there's nothing to start before the beginning of time. So if you say the time started before at this point and there was nothing before, then you don't really need God. You can just say the universe time started at this point with the universe and there was nothing before. Right? I mean, are you saying?
Okay, so let's work that out. So, okay, if that view is true, that our universe did in fact have a beginning, and that there was nothing before the universe, and then our universe came into existence, then that would be assuming that our universe can come into existence out of nothing, uncaused. And is that really a more likely, plausible conclusion based on the data and information that we have, or is it more likely that, premise one? So you'd be arguing against premise one here, right? That whatever begins to exist has a cause.
The universe did not begin to start because there was no time before.
Was there? Well, you just said it started, so I'm going off of what you just said.
The time start, right.
So you just switched. You said our universe started.
Before the start of time, or isn't there? Isn't it? Is there something before start of time, or isn't it?
The question is, if our universe began to exist, what could have caused it to exist?
Beginning and cause implies there's time before.
How so?
Begin and cause means something that happened before, right?
Cause can happen simultaneously to the effect. The cause and the effect can be simultaneous. It doesn't have to be before.
It's something that existed prior that resulted in this thing. How can it be simultaneous?
So then you... Okay, because God, this is how I finish the show. Well, God, while the cause is eternal, the effect is not. So yes, God, I believe that
So
God existed eternally, and he is the one that caused our universe to exist, but the effect of him causing the universe is not, and his decision to create, his moment of creation that brought about the effect of our universe coming into existence happened, and that was the beginning of time. Him existing timelessly is
what
eternal.
what does that mean, timelessly? So basically, the time created universe, and he's eternal. So there was infinite amount of time where God did nothing, and then he created universe. I mean, that makes that's the
So,
you
so I
get
mean,
infinite regress again.
no, I already responded to that because you kept saying there's an infinite amount of time and then he created. I'm saying no, there was a timeless state, and so it was not an infinite amount of time because time
What
had
is a
not
timeless state? That's like
the
saying it's a
point in which
blurb.
there is.
You just kind of name it.
Okay, hold on. This is the same conversation I had with James. Is what do we mean by
Right.
our words? Right. And so you hear timeless and you go, that just means that's nothingness. And I'm saying, oh no, timeless is that without time. And so if God is not physical,
What does that mean
and
without time? What does that
well,
mean? How can you say, okay, there cannot be infinite regress
that's what I'm trying to
because
say. I'm
okay,
trying to
makes
answer
no
the
sense. I'm
question.
saying,
So
right.
going back to what I asked you before, how do we measure time? And time is often measured by a sequential events taking place. This is one of the things in the theological implications that I argued that if God is not physical, then there's no moving molecules and particles, and therefore that's one of the arguments is that if he really is timeless, he has to be non-physical, because if he was physical and molecules are moving, you now have sequential events taking place, and therefore that traces time. And so if you do not have events taking place, then you can live in a timeless state where there's not one thing happened, then something else happened, because nothing is taking place.
So basically, before God created universe, he did nothing until he did something, and because he did nothing, there's nothing before. I mean, that's
I
even
think
more
that's a simple,
complicated.
I don't think so. That's a simple way of saying God simply existed. God just
How?
simply existed, and he's not as a
So he had a
necessary being.
state in no time.
Yes, that would be the Christian view, is that God existed timelessly, without time, sans creation. And then my view is that he entered time at the point of creation. Then he created time and entered time, and has since existed in time. But a state of timelessness is just simply being outside of or unaffected by time, in which we understand the linear flow based upon events taking place. And so if we don't have events taking place, there's not the sequence of time or the measurement of time, and therefore it's a timeless state.
That sounds more convoluted than assuming infinite regress, to tell you the truth. And like I mean, these properties, the state is something that exists as in, in time. That something, state is being, and you're saying something can be without time. It's I just can't comprehend that. But I can comprehend infinite regress, and the way you comprehend it is, well, what happened before this, what, just like you comprehend infinite number, you can comprehend infinite and you're not actually measuring time, you're measuring events, right? But there is nothing that should have, it's not a thing that should have started, it's just existence itself.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because so this, I think, goes back to like Hilbert's Hotel, right? Where we can comprehend that, we can comprehend, and we can have a thought experiment of a hotel with an infinite number of rooms and a different amount of guests check in and check out, and it leaves a different result. Like, we can mathematically make sense of that. But the question is, can such a thing be instantiated into the real world? Can that be actualized?
The hotel cannot.
Okay, so just
if
because
there was such
a
thing, right? The hotel itself, you don't have infinite whatever people.
So but, why can't
you have infinite amount of time? You're comparing something that doesn't exist to something that does exist. Time is not a hotel. Time is not a physical object. Time is just our perception of events, of things happening. There's no reason why it should start. The whole thing of starting and finishing is just describing time. You cannot have time start. Time is what things start in.
Yeah, and I don't know a different way to say it. I'd have to go back and try to figure out a different way to
Yeah.
explain it. My point is what I've tried to make is when you've said if time is infinite, it would take an infinite amount of time to transverse the infinite number of events. And if that, and
Yes.
so if what you're saying, and you disagree, so if what you're saying is true, and I have to go through an infinite number of past events before today arrives, then today would never arrive because I would never finish. So that's where starting and
No,
finishing comes in.
you have been through infinite amount of
Okay,
events.
so have been, the language you just used
Right.
of have been assumes an end point.
No, have been. Why? What would this?
Because you're using past language. I have been, I am
Yes,
not now. So
but-
at one point I was, now I'm not. So there was an end.
Yes.
Okay,
No, there
so-
was a prior. There's before now, but not an end. The before now doesn't mean.
Okay, so there's
You
a
know what I
before and then there's a now. And the question is
Yes.
if I had to be in the before for all of infinity, then I would
Yes.
never get out of the before to be in the now. The fact that I went from before to now shows that at some point I finished and have switched
didn't
from before to now.
No, that's not. There's no switch from before to now. I'm saying. So you're thinking, okay, the infinity cannot be because it would take an infinite amount of time. But now it's future time, not past time. There is an infinite amount of time in past for infinite amount, for infinity to exist, and there is an infinite amount of future, for infinity to exist. And you're saying, well, this will never end, but it doesn't end. It's infinite in the past. It's just you cannot comprehend something that doesn't end. Like you have to see the end, and you cannot see the end, and you're saying, well, it must end somewhere for me to be here, but it doesn't. Mathematically you can always have something before.
Okay, so
Just
let
like
me
you can always
let me ask you
have
this.
another number. You can always have a number bigger than any other number. You can always have time before another time. There's no logical reason why you can't. You're just saying, well, I can't see how this ever ends. Okay, you cannot see it, but it makes logical sense.
So that's what, again, I agree with you that there's, and Craig says that, right? There's nothing logically impossible about this, but it's metaphysically impossible. And here are two reasons, and I do have to run in 3 minutes. So number one would be
Okay,
this.
I'm sorry.
If instead we want to look at this as like, if you're using numbers, right? If 0 is the present, the future is all positive numbers. So tomorrow is 1, and the day after tomorrow is number 2, and then yesterday was -1, and the day before yesterday was -2. And the question is, if I could always add another infinite negative number, a greater and greater negative number, and I had to add as many greater negative numbers as I could before I could ever count to 0, then the question is, will I ever be able to count to 0 from negative infinity?
So you do have 0.
Conceptually, but then could I
No.
instantiate that into
What-
the real world? Could I count to 0 from negative infinity?
The infinity is not a starting point, though. That's the thing. It's a concept. But how can you have 0 if there's always number before? Obviously you have 0, right? Obviously there's 0 exists. So how
Okay.
can you have 0 if there are infinitely many numbers before 0? And that's same thing with your time, right? So how can you have present if you have it? Well, you do. You just do.
Okay, well,
it's not
hold on.
something
I
you
think
can, right?
So it seems like you just made my point, Mirza, is you said, how could you have 0 if you have an infinite number of negative numbers, but the fact that we have 0 is obvious? And that's where I would say,
Yes.
Absolutely. The fact that we have 0 is
Yes.
obvious, therefore, and if we had to have an infinite number of negative numbers, we would not have 0. 0 is obvious, therefore we don't have an infinite number of negative numbers.
But we do have infinite number of negative numbers.
But then we wouldn't have 0 in your view, right?
We do have 0.
Okay, I'm confused. I'm missing something here. Okay, here's my last question, because I do have to run in 2 minutes. You mentioned, again, this idea of mathematically. What are your thoughts on the mathematical absurdities that are created from such an example like Hilbert's Hotel, where yes, we can logically, we can conceptualize of a hotel with all these people checking out, but mathematically it becomes absurd. And so if we're now going to say this is how the real world functions, then it seems like we would have mathematical absurdities in the real world, where you can take an infinity plus an infinity and have an infinity. You can take an infinity minus infinity and have infinity. You can take infinity minus infinity and have 3. You can take infinity minus infinity and have 10. I mean, you can have any possible number. And so this becomes mathematically absurd. And so while we can conceptualize it and think of such a hotel, it becomes absurd when applied to the real world. And so if we're now going to say that's how the real world functions, we now have mathematical absurdities in the real world.
So absurd is not a mathematical concept. It's how you feel. It's how you perceive things. And that's the whole point. And to get back to negative numbers, like, do we have infinite negative numbers? I'm not talking about time. I'm talking about numbers. Do we have infinite negative numbers?
Actual infinite, no.
So what is the smallest number then? What is the biggest negative number?
What is the smallest negative number?
Well, what is the first negative number before there's no other number?
Well, no, you can count forever.
So it is infinite.
So that's a potential infinite because I'm counting forever.
Right.
And
but
again, we can
zero.
say, right. So again, what we can say though is we can conceptualize this. The question is, can it be actualized into the real world? That's what we're talking about when when these arguments are used to point to the beginning of a universe. We're talking about attaching this into the real world, not just staying in this conceptual reality. And so the question is, if it cannot be applied in the physical world.
Time is a concept. So why
a concept that measures the physical changing of events from one to the next.
Right. So why can't you measure all infinitely back?
Okay. Well, that goes back to the conversation that we've had and the confusion I think that we've driven.
Just like
yeah. So
it's the same with numbers. You can always have moment before the last moment, and you can always have number before last number, and this is the same logic. Anyways,
I fully agree with you there. Is but that's the question: is if that then applies to the real world, could that metaphysically make sense in the real world? And I offered some reasons why I don't think it would. So,
all right,
this has been fun though.
All right, nice talking to you.
All right, have a wonderful rest of your day. All right, everybody. Well, yes, I'm out of time. Oh my goodness, I got to go wake up my boys. So again, I will see you next week on Tuesday, looking at philosophy. And so we're going to get a little bit more into metaphysics and epistemology and philosophical anthropology and other things as we look at how the intellectual tradition has shaped areas of philosophy. And then the week after that is going to be on gender with Abigail Favali. Her book, what is it called? A Genesis of Gender. The Genesis of Gender. So anyways, hopefully the show has challenged you to think well and think deeply about these things. They are worth thinking about, and hopefully is giving you some tools and ways of having better conversations as well. As that's why I love Mears and James, who call in often, and everybody else who is here. I love the calls. I love the conversations of showing how Christians and atheists can think about these things and do so well and respectfully, and really batting a lot around these ideas and hopefully taking each other's ideas seriously. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day. Continue thinking deeply about these things, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.